Hey, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us once again. Before we begin our COVID webinar today, I'll just make a few technical notes. The webinar panel is the blue or orange flower icon on your screen. Here you'll find a handout section where you can download today's presentation. There's also a section called questions where you can type your questions for our panelists today, and we do our best to answer them live throughout the presentation. Following the webinar, please take a moment to complete a short survey letting us know your experience today. And if you have any interest in upcoming webinars, there'll be a section where you can select which ones you may be interested in. We'll help guide our planning sessions. You will receive a recording of today's session by email tomorrow. I will now introduce Laura Jones, our Executive Vice President and Chief Strategic Officer. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Alexa, and welcome everyone to our weekly webinar, or I should say just about weekly webinar. And we did hear from several of you last week who were worried about where were we. Occasionally we skip a week, just if there's not a lot happening, we definitely don't want to be in the position of wasting your time. So we occasionally do skip a week, but by and large, we're here most weeks. And I am joined by my very capable colleague, Corinne Pullman and Brendan Rolfe, and Rachel's with us today as well. So maybe everyone can pop up on your videos and say a quick hello. So Corinne is our expert in all things to do with Ottawa, at least that's what I call her, but she does a lot more than that for the organization. But for the purposes of these webinars, she's just amazing on all the different programs and our advocacy at the federal level. And Brendan and Rachel are on our helpline, so they take calls from business owners right across Canada on questions, and try and navigate and get answers. So they're also very, very in touch with what's happening at a practical level with the programs. And I work with our research team and also our national lobbying team and our counseling team across Canada. So the four of us together will try and do our best to answer as many of your questions as we can and provide you with the information that you need and the information that is most up to date in terms of what's happening with governments and what we're hearing both on the phone lines, but also Corinne and I, as we're in various conversations with government officials, what we're hearing behind the scenes. So that's what we really try to do on these webinars. And we'll all be back with you in a moment, but we'll go to the next slide and I'll just make a few more introductory comments on our commitment to keep our website up to date. Many of you have heard this before, but I like to keep this slide up there so people know where to go, especially if you're new to these webinars. Our helpline is there and our website is there. And as Alexa mentioned, the handout, under the handout section, you've got this whole deck, so you don't have to scribble this down. You can save the deck for yourself, and I'll put this back up at the very end of the webinar as well. If we go to the next slide. I always like to start these before we dive into all of the details of the government programs and what's happening there. I like to start with a few quotes just to remind ourselves to kind of stay grounded. And I don't know, resilience seemed to be the theme that was speaking to me this week. So I like the one that from pain comes wisdom, from fear can come courage, and from suffering can come strength. If we have the virtue of resilience, and that hard times are sometimes blessings in disguise. We do have to suffer, but in the end, it makes us strong, better, and wise. And I don't know, something that seemed a bit poetic about my barn having burned down. I can now see the moon. And so just a few quotes maybe to lean on during these challenging times, a little bit of inspirational wisdom before we dive into the deep end of the pool with all the various program updates that we have for you today. Although there's not a lot that is new, but it is a good recap this week of what's happening out there. So Corinne in a moment is going to talk to you a little bit about there have been a few new announcements, and then also we wanted to cover off your voice on the upcoming budget. And what we mean by that is, as you know, we survey you, we hear from you on these webinars, we hear from you on the helplines, and we take all of that information and we really are very active around, well, we've been very active throughout the whole COVID crisis, but budgets are a really good opportunity where governments make a lot of announcements. So we wanted to share with you what we are looking for and what we're hearing back from government in terms of their receptiveness to what we've heard you want in the upcoming budget. So Corinne's going to talk about that, and then we'll cover some of the sources of COVID financing, the various programs. So this is more of a review of what we've already gone over before, the third part of this. So for some of you, if you're not interested in that, we've got feedback on the webinars that, you know, it's really hard to please everyone on what it is we're doing. And sometimes we know when we're covering old territory, that's really valuable for some of the people that are on the webinars, but some of you have heard it before. So it's at that third part that you might say, okay, well, I know what's going on with the main programs, and that part you might want to sign off if that's no longer relevant to you. And of course, we'll get to your questions, and we'll do some of that through the webinar, but also, as always, at the end of the webinar. If we go to the next slide, I just like to share a little bit of our current research with everybody. And one of the questions that we have updated is what worries you most about COVID-19? As you can see, small businesses across Canada are very worried about a lot of things. Only 2% of you are saying, I don't have any COVID-related concerns right now. One of the things that's new on this is the sluggish vaccine rollout in Canada, which has got many people worried. The other thing I just wanted to point out is debt, because we've got half of you worried about debt, and we do have a report out today saying that the average business, on average, businesses who have taken on debt have $170,000 worth of COVID debt. Obviously, there's a wide range around that depending on what sector you're in. But that's getting a lot of attention, and that's helping us push some of our other recommendations today. And 7 out of 10 business owners have taken on debt in the hospitality sector and the arts and recreation sector. That's more like 9 out of 10 have taken on debt. So that's something where, as we push for more forgivable portion of CEBA, for example, or the HASCAP loan, this is the kind of research that we use. And I just call your attention to that, because you may fill out our surveys sometimes and wonder, well, what happens to these, to all of these data that you're collecting, CFIB? What are you doing with it? And we're getting it out there actively on your behalf. And I know there's a lot of interest from government too on that debt story, which is a bit counter to the story that's going on around consumers, where it's like, oh, people are saving more because they're spending less. So this is an important piece of the puzzle for them to understand. On the next slide, Corinne, this is where I ask you to join and talk about what's new. And I know there were a few things last week and then a couple of things just yesterday that you're going to talk about. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, and the things from yesterday, well, coming late yesterday, unfortunately, we're not too exciting, but we'll get to those in a minute. But I did want to cover off quickly some of the changes the government announced just late last week, in regards to extending some of the income support programs under COVID that you maybe should be aware of. You may already be aware of, especially if you yourselves have to use the Canada Recovery Benefit, for example, or if you have employees on any of these programs. So what they're doing is increasing the number of weeks you can access the Canada Recovery Benefit, as well as the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit, from 26 weeks to 38, so it's 12 more weeks. That group was going to have their funding run out, sort of coming into the March period, so they've extended that out. So I guess, seeing that potentially this could go on for a few more months, that people are finding that their businesses are restricted, therefore, the ability to retain staff may not be as good as it once was. They're also increasing the number of weeks available under the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. That was the 2 weeks that they pay $500 per week for anybody that needs to go into quarantine or has gotten sick from COVID. They're increasing that from 2 to 4 weeks. I think part of the reasoning there is that with 2 weeks, that's all you can take and sort of over the entire year. So once you've taken your 2 week period, should you have to go into quarantine again or something happens, you would not have any access. So I think they're extending that out to allow people who potentially maybe have more frontline jobs or things like that require them to take some time off should they have been exposed or have to go into quarantine or actually get sick. So they are extending that from 2 to 4 weeks. And of course, part of all of this is the more generous EI program that currently exists. And that program, the more generous version of the EI program, will also increase the number of weeks of eligibility from 24 to 50 weeks. up until September 25th, 2021. So it's still the more generous EI system that's out there, and they've increased the number of weeks you can get it, but they still limit the number of weeks up until September 25th, 2021. That's the point at which the more generous EI program at this point is supposed to come to an end and go back to the regular EI benefit program. So we'll see what happens there. So those were the announcements made last week. So that's something that's in the works right now. We move to the next slide. Late yesterday, there was also a very small announcement out of finance. Basically, these are just their intention to make some technical amendments to legislation. So these aren't actually in place yet, though the first one is already sort of in practice already. But the first one basically just regulates that the revenue decline comparison for the wage and rent subsidies for the period going from December 20th to January 16th. The revenue comparison periods, instead of being basically December only, which is what they were sort of stuck with, it's going to allow you to compare it to November or December. I know this is maybe disappointing for some folks who are also hoping they could compare it to January revenues, but the government didn't go there. So basically for that period between December 20th and January 16th, that's, I believe, is period 11. The revenue comparison for that period will be November and December for that particular period. And then they'll move from there forward. So for period 12, which goes from mid-January to mid-February, they'll do December, January. And then for period 13, which we're in right now, the comparisons will be for January and February. So March doesn't play into any of this at this point, even though the period we're in right now goes into the March period. And on top of that, we have no further news at this point about what happens post March 14th, which is when period 13 ends. We're still waiting for the government to make an announcement on that. And just so you all know, we're putting much pressure on the government to get that information out as soon as possible, including letters and likely a release next week if we hear nothing today or tomorrow. Laura.
Fran, I think it's important to say that these two changes, and I'll cover the one on CSRS, are
Sure.
proposed technical amendments at this point. So, you know, the question of, well, how do I apply? How do I make this change? I think they're already doing the first one you said in practice anyway. The second one, that's not the case. So I just before people start saying, well, how do I access this new support? It's really a proposed technical amendment to legislation. I think it will likely happen, but it's not for sure. So the second thing we got is we have a long list, as many of you who've been on these webinars know, of proposed things that we would like to see changed under CSRS. So one of them seems to have penetrated, although, and so that's good news, but the bad news is still there's a lot outstanding on our list. So we were a little disappointed that this is the only one they're changing as of right now. But one of the things we raised that is that if you're in an opco holdco situation, that you won't have access to the lockdown, or you're less likely to have access to the lockdown support because it's unlikely that your holding company was subject to that. So they are going to find a way to get access to those businesses. Like if you rent, if you own a building and you have a restaurant who rents from your, and those two businesses are non-arm's length, that if your restaurant was forced to be shut down, that you will be able to access that lockdown, that additional lockdown top up through the holdco. So it will be the interest and the property tax relief through the holdco part of the relief that you'll have access to. So it's something, but it's not, we're not cheerleading from the rooftops over it. It was one of the things on our list, and we're still hoping we'll make progress on some other things. For more details on either one of these things, I've put, if you want to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, the release is right there. You can click on that, and there's also a technical backgrounder, and they give some examples. They give actually a pretty good example on the CSRS lockdown in the technical backgrounder. So that's what's new there.
Yeah. So if we move to the next slide, just a couple other quick things. As many of you probably know by now, border travel restrictions, quite strict ones, are now in effect. They basically require COVID testing both pre and post arrival, whether you fly into Canada or drive into Canada. You'll have to have proof that you've taken COVID tests before you arrive, I think within 72 hours, and also after you arrive while you're in quarantine. For those that are flying, there's also a requirement to stay 3 nights in a hotel that you have to pay at your own expense. That is government approved. And then, of course, there's still a 14-day quarantine. If you test negative, you can then move after the 3 days to your own residence. If you test positive, you will then have to go to a government facility to quarantine for the 14 days. But there's a lot of detail. So if you are traveling, or if anybody in your company is traveling, I really recommend you take a look, because there seems to be quite a bit of detail there that's required in order to abide by what the new travel restrictions are. Also important to note that there are still lockdowns in Canada. They remain in effect in parts of Ontario, such as Toronto, Peel, and North Bay, as well as the entire province of Newfoundland and Labrador is now in lockdown. But all other regions are a little more open, but restrictions are pretty much in place everywhere.
And one of the things that is really valuable about these webinars and the work we do on our helpline is just the sharing of intelligence. So if you have dealt with these new border travel restrictions and you have any intelligence to share on how that's working, we'd be grateful to hear about it.
Yes, absolutely. Last thing, of course, though, to try to have a bit of good news. Cases seem to continue to be declining across most jurisdictions in Canada, and it does look like vaccinations are starting to ramp up soon, given that the supplies are starting to come back to normal, and hopefully over the next 4 to 6 weeks, we'll see a real ramp up in vaccinations. Again, at least for the very targeted groups that are vulnerable. So the more people that can get vaccinated, obviously, the more likely we can start opening things up even more. So we're all, I think, waiting anxiously for that to happen. Good. Okay, so that's the what's new section. We wanted to also give you a bit of an update on the next slide, which is around our budget. Oh, so no, there's one more thing. Sorry, forgot about this one. So there is actually a new program we wanted to make sure you're aware of that just came to our attention. It's funded by Visa, but it's an IFundWomen Canada grant program. And basically, it's for obviously female entrepreneurs, and you can see the details there. They're going to be awarding 10 women entrepreneurs a $10,000 grant and a 1 year of coaching. There are a few criteria there, but it's fairly straightforward. We have to be at least a majority owner of the business, a minimum annual revenue of $50K, must have a product or service in the market that generates revenue. And basically, the applications are open now until March 12th. All you really need to do is upload a headshot and photo of you and your team, and do a quick 60-second video where you share some details about your business, what you do with the grant and the coaching if you won, and basically a description of your business. So if you're interested and it's something you may want to look into, there is a link there to apply for this particular new grant program. All right, I think now we're going to move on to budget. So every year, of course, the federal government releases a budget that sort of outlays, of course, how they are spending their money and how they plan to spend their money going forward. It's often an event in which they announce all kinds of new initiatives, whether it's spending or tax initiatives. Last year, we never had one because of the pandemic. Came down right around the time they usually do it, which is usually late March, April. But this year, it looks like they're going to be moving forward with a budget. There have been consultations taking place. We have been very active in trying to get the government to think about ways that they can help small businesses both through the pandemic and into recovery. So we have quite a hefty submission. We did release it last week to the media. We have shared it with the entire federal government, all MPs, for example, many government departments, to make sure we get the information and our recommendations out as broadly as possible. What I did want to share with you today, which is the main component of what we're suggesting, but not everything. We have many more things that are being suggested in the actual document, which you have a link to there. But the one I wanted to share with you is what we're calling our 6-point plan for small business economic recovery. And we tried to sort of highlight what we felt was most important to help small businesses now and in the months to come. First and foremost is really to extend and expand the COVID-19 relief for small business until the entire economy can reopen. And this is important because obviously you can't start pulling back these recovery initiatives until you've been able to open the economy and allow businesses to go back to where they were at one time. If they're still forced to restrict how their business operates, we can't pull away all the supports at that point in time. We may want to figure a different way to target them to those that are most effective. We may want to look at other ways to do it, but we cannot get rid of them. And so we want to make sure that they continue to be there to help small businesses through the next several months and beyond as well. And that includes on the borders, because we know there are many businesses out there that are not being forced to shut down, but are effectively shut down because the borders are closed. So these are, I think, important principles for us. Secondly, we'd like to see a moratorium on any new taxes and costs to small businesses. As many of you know, Canada Pension Plan premiums did go up in January. We tried to push that off for another year. We are facing another carbon tax increase in provinces where that is impacted. So that would be Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. They're the 4 provinces that have a federal carbon tax, which is to go up on April 1st. So we're quite concerned that we'd like to see that also delayed if possible to minimize the impact of new costs on small businesses, but also anything else. Maybe if they want to spend a bunch of money on a new program, we can't really do that right now because we just don't have the cost. We just have the ability to put more costs on businesses, at least right now. Thirdly, really, we need to forgive more small business debt. Laura just talked about a big announcement we did today, which looked at the amount of debt that's been accumulated. 7 in 10 businesses have accumulated some debt with an average of about 170,000. That's a lot of money. And so we need to start looking at ways to help businesses forgive some of that debt. So can we expand the amounts that are available that could be forgiven under CEBA or under the new highly affected sector credit availability program? Can we have a forgivable portion there? Can we have longer repayment terms because we're now a year in and we're not really any further ahead? So those are some of the things we're pushing for on that front. Fourth is introducing hiring incentives, and not just like regular ones, but significant ones, because once we get to a point where things can reopen, we need to get people back into jobs. We need them to help. We need to get you some help to bring those people back into your businesses as well. And if you have a lot of debt, that could be a bit daunting. So if we can find ways to provide significant hiring incentives to bring those employees back into businesses as quickly as possible and offset some of the costs that have been imposed during the pandemic, such as the CPP increases we talked about. Fifth is reducing red tape, making that a priority. We've seen some pretty interesting government initiatives throughout the pandemic to get through red tape that would normally be in place to help businesses. For example, opening up patio space, allowing businesses to operate on closer to roadways than normally would, just to help them through this area. We can do it. Let's look at ways that we can continue to do that. And so pushing government to make it a priority and basically eliminate some of those unnecessary regulations that still exist. And finally, we want them to hold off on introducing any kind of consumer incentives. There are talks of finding ways to get consumers back in the doors of businesses, which is great, but you can't do that until those businesses are fully reopened. And you can't do it before those small businesses are part of being that reopening. So many larger businesses, of course, have had the opportunity to continue to operate, and we don't want all the money going to them. So we can't give those incentives until everybody is fully open and able to benefit from those types of incentives. So those are the 6 snapshots that we're kind of really pushing for. If you are interested, there are more details in the link there. All right, so we'll move on to the sort of core piece of this. What we wanted to do on the next few slides is just remind you of what's still available when it comes to COVID financing, because there has been so many programs that have been introduced federally and provincially over the course of the last almost year now, and some of them have started to disappear. Some of them are still around. Some of them are disappearing soon. So we just want to make sure you knew right now what is available and what we understand the deadlines to be if you have not yet taken advantage of some of them. The first, of course, is the Canada Emergency Business Account, CEBA, which is now up to $60,000. It could be the 40 plus the 20, or if you've never applied for it before, you can apply for the full 60. Of that $60,000, 1/3 is forgivable, which is $20,000 if you're able to pay it back by the end of 2022. It is interest-free, and you have to get it from your bank. And you have there's sort of two sort of parameters to it. One is the payroll stream, which is have 20,000 to 1.5 million in payroll, or you have to go through the non-deferrable expense stream if you don't have that level of payroll, and you have to have at least $40,000 in non-deferrable expenses to qualify. This does have a deadline, and it's coming up soon. So if you have not yet applied for the emergency business account or for the extension, if you've already have in the past, you may want to consider it because it is slated to expire at the end of March. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. There is a deadline for this one, and it is coming very soon. Rachel.
Just wanted to add the fact that we've heard a lot of businesses over BR asking or mentioning that they haven't been eligible or have been not successful at getting their 20K expansion. And a lot of people have been told they have to wait till the end of February. Initially, they were told they had to wait at the end of January, and then it was extended. And that just for a little bit of color, that this is because the EDC is creating a new enhanced, updated CEBA portal to get some of these people the 20K. But if that's available towards the end of February, do we think that will change the deadline? I don't know if that's something you can touch on.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think part of the thinking is they do want to sort of have CEBA come to an end. There have been over 800,000 businesses that have applied for CEBA. And frankly, there's only about 1 million businesses that would be eligible for it. So I think they feel like they're coming to the end of the lifespan. But I think what they may do is that if you've made your application prior to March 31st, but maybe has still not been fully finalized, they may allow that to go on beyond March 31st. So my strong encouragement is I think that there's a good chance they're going to try to end it March 31st, 2021. But so therefore, if you think that it's something you may need or want, you should get your application in. And I suspect they will honor that post March 31st if you're still waiting to hear a response. But that is one that will continue to sort of push them to see whether they can extend it further. So just quickly on the CEBA, there are issues still that we're pushing for. One of the biggest issues is on the non-deferrable expense stream. We know that many of the non-deferrable expenses are quite limited, the list that they allow. There's also a requirement to have a contractual relationship prior to March 1st. This has become very problematic because many small businesses don't have like a contract or written contract in place. That it may be verbal, it may be something they've been doing for years, but it's not being considered or allowed. So those are some big gaps in that program that we're continuing to try to apply pressure on the government to fix. The second point is one that Rachel just sort of raised, of course, that we know there's a number of businesses out there who are still waiting. They got in not successful on their attempt to get the CEBA expansion loan and are still waiting to see if that's something they can still get or not. And so hopefully we'll hear more about that this week because they did say end of February. And if you're in that category, we encourage you to reach out to your bank and reach out to EDC to find out more about where your application is at if you don't hear anything by the end of the week. Next one. Next slide, please. Thanks. So, of course, the other ones that are still available are the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. The current period is all we know right now. So that ends on March 13th. And that is the one that still allows up to 75% wage subsidy. There are a number of calculations behind that, of course, that we're happy to walk you through if you need some help with that. Our counselors are certainly well versed on it. The current formula, though, this formula that we know right now does end after March 13th, but we do know that some form of the wage subsidies is supposed to exist until June. What we don't know is what the level of the subsidy will be, what the revenue comparisons will be, given that March of last year we started to move into the actual zone. So there's still some issues here and pressure we're putting on government, one, to get that information out as quickly as possible. But in addition to that, there's still improvements that are needed. For example, new and many seasonal businesses are still not eligible for the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. So that's a big one for us. We're really pushing hard on trying to get new businesses some access to some kind of financing. They've had none of the programs actually really look at new businesses. There is no lockdown support like there is for the rent subsidy on the wage subsidy. So it's another area we have raised repeatedly. The other one is you can't include dividends that are paid to the business owner within the subsidy, even though the business owner who pays themselves a salary can be included. So we believe that there's some ways that we can sort of fix this. And of course, the last is that the periods 1 to 5 are now closed. You can no longer apply for any wage subsidy for the periods from March to July. There were some folks that were a little taken off guard by that and surprised by it. We have tried to push government to sort of reopen it where those may still want to apply, but they've been pretty clear that they don't plan to do that. So going forward for periods 6 and 7 and 8, it's 180 days after the end of that period where that period will no longer be open for applications. So 6 months after each period is when each of those periods will no longer be able to be applied for. So if you do want the wage subsidy for those previous periods and have not yet applied, make sure you do it within 6 months from the end of that period.
Also just wanted to note, period 6 is closing as of today. So yeah.
There you go. So thank you, Rachel. Yes. So that's what's happening. So period 6 will also be closing down very shortly. So, all right, next slide. Of course, the next one that is still available, and Laura, I don't know if you want to join me on this one. Laura is our rent subsidy guru who has taken it on herself to make sure that government pays attention to our issues here. So I'll turn this one over to you.
Thanks, Corinne. And yeah, in terms of the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy Program, the basics are here that you can read. It's providing up to 90% of your wages. That depends on you being eligible for the top up. And like with Sue's, we're waiting to find out what the new formula will be post March 13th, but we know some form of the program will be available until June. So we've got some gaps here again, like with the CEWS program, the new business is not eligible. We've talked a lot on these webinars about the OpCo, HoldCo issue, and we're continuing to work on that. We're also, the one I'm more optimistic that we're going to get traction on is the requiring the tenant to pay the landlord in full within 60 days. We raised that just last week directly with the finance minister, and heads seem to be nodding. So I think we hopefully will be able to fix that. The SECRA not access, that one I'm less optimistic about. But I also wanted to mention just a couple things. We are going to have a petition on this. For those of you, actually it was on the last webinar, somebody asked me, what else can I do to help with the OpCo HoldCo issue? And that got me thinking that we need a petition specifically on these issues to get to government. So we're working on that now. And then I just wanted to thank one of the webinar participants. I was just busy filling in some questions, and let's see, I just wanted to thank Adam for the suggestion that we include that in our recommendations we expand the right now the maximum you're eligible for under the program is 300,000 of rent support. It's 75,000 per period. But Adam, you're quite right that if the program gets extended, we should also lift that cap, and that wasn't on our list. So just wanted a quick thank you to Adam on that. And then Corinne, I will turn it back over to you. I think as we go to the next slide.
Yes, thanks, Laura. All right, so another program that's currently available is the Highly Affected Sectors Credit Availability Program. We did speak briefly about it when it was first introduced earlier in February or late January. It seems to be slow in getting going. I know if anybody had tried to apply at some of the banks, they were not necessarily activating it. We had a call just this week with BDC, BD Business Development Bank of Canada, which is sort of overseeing this particular program. And they have assured us now that all the banks, all the major banks, the big ones, are on board now. They're still trying to onboard. They have about 40 banks now on board for this program. They're hoping to get another 35 to 40 in the next week or two. But basically what it is, it allows you to get loans between 25,000 and 1 million at 4% interest with up to 10-year terms. The nice thing is there's no personal guarantee required, which is unusual now for a lot of these programs. It's not the case with CORSIVA. You again have to apply for your primary business bank, but because not all the banks may be involved, at some point, if your bank is not one of the ones involved and it's not listed on the BDC website, you will be able to go get it at another bank. But they just want to make sure that they've given all the banks the opportunity to be involved. So give it another week or two if your bank is not yet offering it, but the big five certainly are. For this one, in order to prove that you're eligible, you have to sustain a 50% revenue drop or more for at least 3 months within the 8 months prior to applying for the loan. And you have to have applied already for CSRS or CEWS. That is how they're basing the amount of the revenue drop. So if you've never applied for it, but you're eligible, you're going to have to apply for it to show, because that's how they're going to get the revenue drop information for you. If you're not eligible for CSRS or CEWS, you can still apply, but they may ask you for more information on financial statements and so forth to validate your revenue drop criteria. The other thing to know, and this has already come up, is why we wanted to make sure, is that based on the loan size, the risk assessment by the bank may become more strict. So any loans under $100,000, all you have to show is that you were a viable business prior to the pandemic. They don't look at your record since the pandemic began. So prior to March 1st, you were a viable business. That should be really the only criteria they look at for any loans under $100,000. As we go up from there, there are some stricter parameters around making sure that you have a good credit score, especially for loans over $250,000. That's where they start bringing in a few other sort of things to look at, whether or not you'll be eligible. This loan is now available till June 30th, so that has a few more months to go. The things we're working on in this, there's no forgivable portion right now. As we talked about, debt is a huge issue. We want to make sure, especially for those that are highly affected. So we're really pushing hard for government to give a forgivable portion to this particular loan. We also know that for a good proportion of our members that are interested in getting this loan, they're not going to because they're worried about the extra debt. But if there was a forgivable portion, that may encourage them to do so. So we are pushing hard for a forgivable portion on this particular loan. There are still some issues with the banks not communicating fully this new loan program to their frontline staff. So if you run into that at one of the big banks, please let us know. You can also call BDC and we can make sure that that's communicated to the banks, because there are some communications issues still between the sort of corporate bank and their branches. And again, unfortunately, newer businesses are not eligible. So we're still working hard on finding some kind of financing for those newer businesses. Next slide. A couple more that we'll just talk about that are still available. The Regional Relief and Recovery Fund. So this is a fund that is administered through the regional development agencies. They are supposed to provide similar loans as the Canada Emergency Business Account, so the 40 and 20 or even up to $60,000, with a proportion of that being forgivable. Some of them will also provide other types of loans to assist small businesses during the pandemic. The weird thing is it kind of varies from regional development agency to regional development agency a little bit. So we do know, for example, and these are the links to them, that the Quebec agency, the ones in Southern Ontario, Northern Ontario, and the Western Canada one are all offering right now some form of CFIB extension loan for anybody who's already had the RRRF before. And I should say that you can only really apply for the RRRF if you are not eligible for any of the regular ones, such as CFIB, CEWS, or CSRS. It's really meant for people who are businesses that aren't able to access any of the other loans. The Atlantic version and the Northern version aren't as involved in the CEBA-like loan, but they do have some other types of funding. So we'll encourage you in those areas to also visit them if you're looking for some financing as well. And it's a warning, it is a bit more of a complicated and lengthy process than what you'll find under CEBA, for example. Rachel.
Yeah, I thought I should just mention that some of these RDAs are providing a triple RF that is under 40K, that is a CEBA-like loan, but then some of them are also offering much more, and they're also still calling that the triple RF or the REEF or whatever you're calling it. Yeah. And so like
so it really does vary, and it's worth contacting your RDA to see what's available for what you're looking for. So it could be a loan, it could be a forgivable loan, it could even be a grant. So there really does vary, and that's causes it to be a bit complicated. All right, I think I have one more, and then we'll jump into questions. And the last slide really is around, so one more, please change slides, please. Thank you. Provincial support programs. A bit busy, so I apologize for that, but we didn't want to leave you without telling you that there are provincial support programs still available in many provinces. They're really meant to provide additional help when the businesses are in lockdown or restrictions. And all of these provinces still have programs in place. Some of them are ending March 31st. So for example, in British Columbia, both of the programs they have there, the recovery grant and the online grant, are slated right now to end on March 31st, but I know our BC colleagues are lobbying hard to have that extended. We know also the Alberta grant is ending on March 31st, but they have announced a new grant, which is a little bit more complicated and difficult, that will be replacing it. So we're watching that closely as well. In Saskatchewan, the emergency business payment and the adaptation rebate are both slated to end in March. Again, our colleagues in Saskatchewan are pushing hard to have those deadlines extended because we know that there's still money in those programs. Manitoba just extended their bridge grant to March 31st. Don't know where that one's going to go. So that one, if you're in Manitoba, you may want to take advantage of if you have not yet already. The Ontario grant is still out there. They don't really have a deadline. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to deadline, but it is still out there. Quebec has a couple of loan programs, a loan program, and for those in the highly affected sectors or highly affected areas, can get some of that loan forgiven. And then New Brunswick is the only Atlantic Canada region that has a grant program at the moment, and that's for $5,000. There's no deadline on that one. It is a first come, first serve. So if it is something in New Brunswick you want to use, you should think about getting it, because it will, once the money runs out, they will stop then. So there are details on all of these in the appendix, as well as links to the applications. So please go there if any of these seem like something that you may still want to look into. All right, maybe bring Laura back for this one.
Thanks, Corinne. So we are looking at upcoming webinars. And so next week, we've got some guests from the employment law firm to answer questions on how to manage employees. So we've heard your feedback that it's helpful often when we have guests on specific topics to round out these webinars. I know the tax ones were very well attended. March 11th, we've got guests from BDC to discuss the HASCAP program, and that was based on your feedback in a previous webinar that yes, that would be helpful. But we're also looking at some other topics that have come up. People approach us now wanting to know whether there are various topics that would be of interest to you. So possibly one on cybersecurity. Another possibility would be one on selling into international markets, such as China. And we'd love your feedback on which of these webinars you might like to see us proceed with. And I think we've added a question to our survey that we usually do right after this webinar. And so if you take the time to fill that out, we would appreciate it, or just put it in the chat, and we pay attention to all of your comments. So this would be very helpful. And of course, any other recommendations that you might have for us, topics you'd like us to cover, that would be helpful. The one that was just late breaking news from right before this webinar is the health, from the Health Office of Canada. So we may be able to get from a public health official to come on and talk about some of the health related aspects around the pandemic, if that's of interest. I know there are a lot of topics, a lot of interest in what's, where this might be going, vaccine rollout, how quickly we're going to get that. So that's another possible topic. Let's move to the next slide. And I think we're on to just our important tip, which many of you have heard me say before, just keeping a little log or a journal of the, it's complicated with all these programs that you're trying to keep up with, and deadlines like the provincial programs that you might have meant to check out, and now, oh, end of March, they're expiring. Great to just take a note and circle that and have a look at it. And of course, if any of us can be of any help with this, please let us know. And with that, I think we are on to questions. So I will ask Rachel and Brendan and Corinne to come and join me, and we will take as many of your questions as we can while they're coming onto the screen. Maybe we'll start with some rent questions, because I've had a chance to be looking at some of these questions while you've been talking, Corinne, and then maybe we'll move to some of the questions that are in your area. But Rachel, here's one that I didn't have the answer to on rent that you may, from the helplines, be more plugged into. It's a question from Zoe, and it's regarding to apply for the January 17th to the February 13th period. Do we have to wait until the end of February? So in other words, when is the application open for the January 17th to the February 13th period? And either Brendan or Rachel probably has the answer to that, I'm guessing.
Yeah, essentially you do have to wait for the period to end before you can apply for it, because you're not supposed to be receiving a subsidy for something that you haven't paid yet. So that's kind of the reasoning that CRA would give you.
Okay, so typically when does, when would that be so that
So
people
the
have
day after the end of the period.
after the end of the period? So again, if you've got a business journal, that might be a good thing to just take a note of. I can apply for the subsidy the day after the period ends, because it is confusing, and the periods themselves are confusing because they don't line up with calendar months. They're all over the place. So that's a good thing to note down for everyone. Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, I think I should probably mention that in the special circumstances where we're waiting, everyone's waiting, like right now, for future periods, and legislation has to pass, sometimes there's a bit of a delay in those specific circumstances. So if that's the case, don't panic. Yeah, make sure to get your journal.
Okay, okay, great. And yes, and we are all anxiously waiting to know what those formulas will be once we hit that mid-March point, but we haven't heard yet. So this is another interesting one on the CSRS program. Rahim is asking, if down the line we want to rent a new outlet location that will qualify for rent, will that qualify for the rent subsidy based on the year-over-year drop, or only the old rent locations will be eligible? And Rachel, this is a problem, I think. And I might repeat that because it is a bit complicated, but she's basically going to add a new location and is wondering how that's going to affect the rent subsidy. And this is a bit of a problem, I think, we're flagging with government, because the challenge is that that new location, assuming it's making sales, is going to add to the entity level revenue, right? And that is what is being compared. So it actually could put you in a worse position. So it doesn't really, it's the entity level, not the location level, that the rent subsidy applies to. Now, if you only have one location, then you're not worried about that. But if you have multiple locations, this is a bit of an issue that we're flagging because it's a disincentive to grow. I just wanted to make sure I had that right. And if there was anything else you wanted to add, Rachel, to that.
Yeah, I'd probably add that there is an election to an asset election that she might want to talk to her accountant about, to maybe get the new asset and not have that included in her revenues. But that also means that that location is not likely to be eligible for the CSRS, because they wouldn't have an agreement backdating to October 9th, I think. So that location would not be able to get the CSRS, but
right.
the existing one might still.
Yeah, and it's another related issue to this, is that we are fighting for those newer businesses to have access to both rent and wage subsidies. So those businesses that started post March. So that's a related issue. So hopefully that helps. Brendan, I'm going to go to you. I see you answering the questions. I can see you're reading and answering. Is there anyone that you'd like to pose verbally to the group from your pile?
Yeah, so there is one, and Corinne and Laura, this one will likely be for you, though. Rachel never fails to surprise me at how much she knows about these things too. There's been a few comments made that it's not looking good for the expansion of the CEBA program to 80,000 with an additional forgivable portion. Is there anything we're hearing in regards to that? I know it's a lot of it's speculation at this point. And I also want to point out our internal mantra of never give up, never go away. And the fact that a lot of these programs weren't supposed to be expanded or extended, but due to CFIB's persistence and tenacious lobbyists, they have been. So, anyways, I'll defer to you guys to speak to the fact of whether or not we're hearing more about that expansion.
Yeah, maybe I'll start, and Corinne can add in to this. I would make a couple comments. One, it's been the most used of all the programs. So about 60% of our members on our surveys are saying that CEBA has been useful. And I know that does get the heads nodding federally, Corinne, when we were mentioning that that's a popular program. The second thing I will mention is this release we did today on debt. We are pushing as part of that more forgivable portion of CEBA, and also having a forgivable portion of the HASCAP loan, as debt forgiveness being one of the things that is really important. And Corinne, I know, mentioned that with our budget recommendations. And I would say that I think, Corinne, while I wouldn't want to place a bet on it at this point, I would say that the odds are getting better, that there's more understanding that debt forgiveness is an important thing that we need to do for small business than there was, say, even a couple of months ago. And that's something we've been flagging regularly with the media. So Corinne, I don't know in your conversations if you want to add to that, but I think the finance minister at least understands our point on this. Whether they then do something is another matter, but I would say it's not as hopeless as some of the other things that we might be fighting with our never give up, never go away attitude. Some have better odds than others. I would say this one's not terrible.
Yeah, I'd say it's a 50-50. I do have one listener, Ugo, who said that they heard a rumor that government will increase the total loan to 80,000. So who knows, right? We all have different sources. And so we're certainly hopeful in that regard, and we'll continue to put pressure on them. I do, as Laura said, agree that the debt, I think, is a very compelling reason, and we're using it as a central reason for economic recovery, is to help those businesses pay off debt. One way to do that is to expand the CEBA loan and the forgivable portion. So we'll continue to pressure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else in your pile, Brendan, before I maybe move to Rachel and then Corinne?
Yeah, one more that I would like to discuss is there's a few questions surrounding it, and it's an area I believe we addressed last time as well, but it's getting more heat and more press, quite frankly. Is the appearance of those who refuse to wear a mask without a valid exemption in your place of business, and what supports are available to you. Just to reiterate, we do have a webinar forthcoming with Sherrard and Cuz about these types of situations, so do tune in the following weeks. But I can tell you as well that the advice right now from government as well as from WCB is to call the police. In most provinces, the police are responsible for enforcing and fining, quite frankly, non-mask adherence in workplaces. So you are advised to call them. A few other tips is do not engage. You've probably seen a few of the videos floating around of the unfortunate situation in Canadian Tire. Advise your staff not to physically engage anyone. Obviously, you should try as much as possible to enforce it verbally. Remain as neutral and unemotional as possible. Now, a lot of the radical folks who are coming in trying to prove a point or trying to get a rise out of you know that. But try to remain as separated from the issue as possible, and just reinforce the fact that you have no choice, and the government is requiring you to enforce these measures, regardless of your own personal opinion, and that if you don't, you can face thousands of dollars in fines. So as much as possible, try to disconnect yourself from the emotions of it, and do call the police right away. That is the advice that we've been given so far. And know as well, actually, I just came from before this from a meeting with WCB, so WorkSafe BC in British Columbia. Know that there may be supports coming as well from the WCB side, that they realize this is an issue and a growing issue, and that they are working with the provincial governments right now to find more supports for you to enforce these measures, while still required of you to enforce them. That's all from me.
Thanks, Brendan. That's an interesting one. And I think that webinar that you're referring to is our webinar that's coming up next week, if I'm not mistaken, looking for the nodding head. Brian and Rachel, yeah. I haven't mixed up my dates. So next week's webinar will be about employment issues. So if that's of particular interest, we'll also cover what's new and some of the other questions, but we'll have a bit of a focus on that because I know there are a lot of questions coming through our helpline on that. Rachel, what do you want to cover from your pile of questions?
I have a question, I think it's probably for Corinne. It's from Martin. He says that the CEWS legislation defines the application period as 180 days after the end of the period. CRA is understanding this to mean that amendments would increase the amount of the subsidy as a result of the year-end bonuses cannot be accepted. Is there any discussion about allowing amendments after 180 days? And I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think an update, or if you can elaborate, that would be great.
Yeah, my understanding is that amendments after the 180 days are only if it's to give CRA and the government back money that is owed to them. So if it's to your advantage, if it's something that you could have maybe, added extra into your application, it would have given you a larger subsidy, those amendments are not allowed any further after 180 days. So the only amendments you can make are ones in which you're realizing you made a mistake and actually maybe took too much subsidy and have to pay it back. Those can be done. So unfortunately, yeah, it depends on the type of amendment you're going to be making.
Speaking of timelines for things, and this is a bit of a switch, but Nadine is asking if anyone has received their Back to Work Manitoba funds yet. Applications due in February, and she still hasn't heard anything. But I'm going to pose a more general question. That's Nadine's question. So if anyone's heard specifically, any webinar participants specifically in Manitoba want to take that, we'll share that information. But more generally, Rachel, could you speak to, and Brendan, could you speak to the timelines on some of these? There's a lot of provincial programs out there, and we hear this a lot on the helpline, right? I'm worried, I haven't heard anything. So what do you expect, and what do you do if you're starting to worry that you haven't heard anything? And maybe at what point do you start to worry? After a week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months? Like what kind of advice would you give people? Because I know a lot of people are in this situation.
Do you want to take this one, or do you want me to take this one, Brendan?
Yeah, I mean, we can tag team this one, Rachel. And we've been hearing on the phone lines, obviously, a lot of concerns surrounding this. And I wish I had a uniform answer for you. Some provinces are doing a pretty reasonable job of staying in communication and letting people know about the status of their applications. Some provinces are doing a terrible job at it. And I won't point fingers at this time, but we are saying don't hesitate to reach out to them and inquire about the status of your application. Do keep our provincial offices informed of what you're hearing, because we do have pretty regular meetings actually with government lined up across the West, and I know in the East as well. And they're asking for feedback. Now, a lot of the feedback we have to offer, of course, is negative in regards to some of these programs because they are struggling to keep up with the demand. But they do want to hear the feedback, and they are working to fix things. Like, I'll give you an example. For instance, the BC SME Recovery Grant that was rolled out in BC at first was absolutely atrocious. The eligibility criteria was such that so few businesses could actually apply for it that the government came back to us in our office to say, what's going on here? Why can't people apply? And we were able to give them feedback. And actually, they did change the criteria to lower from 70% and 50% eligibility criteria down to 30% in terms of revenue loss. And we're trying to work with them further to lower it down to 10% actually for more eligibility access. But the point there is that every province is different. They will not penalize you for contacting the government and asking about the status of your applications. And if you're not hearing back from them when you do, please reach out to us at CFIB to see if maybe there's anything we can share with you on a regional basis, as well as if there's anything we can do to help get a little bit more information for you from the government where they are being non-responsive. Rachel, do you have anything to add on that?
And I kind of want you guys to point fingers. I mean, I kind of want you to say, look, if you're in these provinces and you haven't heard anything, that's not surprising. But if you're in, these provinces and you haven't heard anything, you might want to check on it, because that might be helpful for the participants.
Yeah, I was just about to say, well, Brendan already mentioned it, but never give up, never go away, right? Make sure you're contacting those organizations and letting them know that you want the status, and make sure that you write down who you're talking to. Keep that journal in handy. Keep that email that you received from them, because often when you send that to us, then we have a kind of a breadcrumb trail to follow and say, well, look, this is exactly what our members are experiencing. Tell us we're wrong here, and help us help you guys, essentially.
It's really helpful in our advocacy too, actually, in those stories, isn't it, Rachel? Where it's like, business phoned 3 times and, and then was put on hold, or there was no answer, or whatever it was, and it's been trying since, whenever, December, to find out the status of this, and we still don't know. That's the kind of thing that helps you escalate it, helps us in our advocacy. So those stories are great. So again, those journals can come in handy. But are there any provinces that are particularly worrisome in this regard right now?
I mean, I'm just gonna throw it out there because I'm in Ontario, but I think Brendan once told me we're the Ontariables or something like that. Yeah, the Ontario provincial government and the small business grant has been very, very backlogged. I know a lot of people don't know how to amend their application because they haven't provided that kind of pathway for those applicants. I know some people are not getting declined emails from that program, but they're only receiving an email if they have been approved. And these are all stories that we would welcome in the BR phone lines if you have it as well.
So
I have a lot of those in my questions here. So there's lots of Ontario members who are not hearing anything. They applied back in January. They still haven't heard anything. There's others who are very concerned about the fact that tourism businesses are not included. So these are all things that we're going to share with our Ontario legislative team as well, who I know are working hard on trying to make improvements to the program and make it a better program. So all of this is super helpful. So thank you for sharing it with us, because it's integral. And I know many of you are very frustrated with what's going on in Ontario right now.
Yeah, and so, but to Nadine's question about hearing, she had everything in mid-January and she still hasn't heard anything. I'm guessing that's not unusual.
No, not at all. 2 weeks to 4 weeks is actually a good time to hear back, believe it or not. And 6 weeks to 8 weeks to 10 weeks is not uncommon either to hear back about applications. And I'll point fingers. BC has been bad. Ontario has been bad. It's basically a lesson on what not to do in regards to how to administer your programs. Surprisingly, the prairies have been a little bit better. I don't know why I said surprisingly. They've been a lot better in terms of administering their programs and a lot more eager about helping small business, it seems, as have the Maritimes. They've been doing a little bit better with their program rollouts. It could be due to the population densities, but quite frankly, I mean, that's a pretty weak excuse, because you have big populations, and when you're going to roll out a program, you should know what the demand is going to be. So anyways, finger pointing, there it is. I'm not going to get a job with government anytime soon now, am I?
Corinne, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but I'm going to sneak in one more CSRS question. So Denise is asking that if she owns the holdco and pays rent, is she now, can she now qualify CSRS for the operating company? And Denise, this is the change they're making. I think you're referring to the change we said they're proposing to make, is essentially to allow not the opco but the holding company to access the additional top up, the lockdown top up, if your operating company has been affected by a restriction. So I know that's probably clear as mud, but basically they understood our criticism of the lack of access to the emergency pop-up provision if you're under some restrictions, and they basically allowing you to get access, but it's still through the holding company, not through the operating company, even though it would be the operating company that suffers the restrictions. So hopefully that clarifies things a little bit for people. I know it's a little bit complicated, and we'll continue to answer the questions because this is one of those ones we probably have to go over a few times. Sorry, Corinne, let me go to you now. You've been very patient.
Yeah, I do have a number of Sue's questions. I may ask one or two just to sort of round out some of them. And I don't know, Rachel or Brendan, if you can help me with some of these. Amber is saying that they did not have any revenue drop for 1 month, so Sue's site would not allow them to enter information. Amber wants to know if she can now be able to apply and submit for periods after that, since my information was not entered for that one period. They can apply, right? Yeah. So
Yep.
you don't have to apply every single period. You can apply for just those periods in which you had revenue drops. And so that's totally fine. I also had an interesting one from VJ who said cable TV costs, including specialty sports programming, is usually very high for restaurants. Is something happening to get businesses out of such contracts? And that's a very interesting question, VJ, and one I think we haven't heard before. But I don't know if you've tried contacting your cable supplier to see if they'd be willing to give you some flexibility. If not, it's definitely something that we should take a look at, and we can certainly try to apply pressure to those large companies. We know they're pretty tough when it comes to these kinds of contracts, and it's always very difficult to get out of them. But thank you for raising that. I think it's important. I'm sure you're not the only one in that situation that's still paying bills that you can't use the services for. So the last one I will mention is I had one listener, Asutosh, I think is your name. Is there any way wholesalers can apply for the Ontario Provincial Support Program? I know there's very specific categories that are not getting into various support programs. And I think for the Ontario Support Program, there are a number of you, including tourism, for example, that aren't able to get in. So as we just talked about, we'll continue to raise this with our Ontario legislative team because we know there's lots of gaps in that particular grant program. So thank you again for bringing that to our attention because it's important for us to know. I'm recognizing that we're over time, so I am going to sort of push it back to you, Laura. And again, hopefully we can try to answer your questions as quickly as we can as we come to the end of the webinar.
Yeah, thank you. And I always feel badly when there are questions that we haven't been able to answer. We do try and answer as many as we can through the webinars, but our runway is getting short. So we'll wrap up and but assure you that we do use your questions for our website reviews and also for future webinars. We look at the questions that we didn't answer and say, what else as things evolved? We need to continue to push to the top of the agenda for all of you. I'm going to typically we wrap things up with just a quick comment from each of us, and so we'll go to that portion of the webinar. And for those of you who just joined us, we typically do go a little over. We probably should actually schedule them for an hour and 15 or something like that, so everybody knows that. But just because there's so much to get through, Brendan, I'm going to go to you first, then I'll go to Rachel and Corinne, and then we'll wrap up. I'll wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Laura. My usual plug for self-care still applies. You are the leader of the crew and captain of the ship, and I encourage you to look into various ways to get outside, get some fresh air as the sunshine starts shining a little bit more and the temperatures start to warm up. I also want to encourage you, if possible, to really take an interest in your employees' mental health at this point as well. It's wearing on everyone, yourself included, your employees, and having informal sessions each week where you guys discuss maybe the stressors that you're feeling, not only in the workplace, but also at home, will go a long way to having everyone feel a little bit more supported. The CFIB, we're taking a lot of those steps as well to ensure that everyone's mental health is a focal point, because of course to remain productive and remain happy workers, we all need to take care of ourselves and take care of one another. So I'd advise you, as well as looking at your own mental health, is reach out to your employees today and just check in to see how they're doing. A simple "how you doing" goes a long way. And then make it one of those platforms where everybody can speak freely and without judgment, just in regards to how they're feeling and how you can support one another. We actually had a really great initiative that was suggested by Laura. We call it a walking group, and it's just 10 minutes per day where we all peel ourselves away from the work stressors, and we go outside and we have a quick walk outside, get some fresh air in your lungs and think about other things, maybe go sing a song or do what you have to do. But it's been really immensely popular here, and actually we found it's made a big difference in terms of overall mental wellness in the workplace and connectivity with one another. So as simple as 10 minutes outside, taking a quick walk has done wonders for us, and I would suggest looking at some creative solutions for your crew as well.
Thanks, Brendan. Rachel.
Yes, I actually should have probably mentioned this earlier, but eWorkplace, we've been hearing on the BR phone lines that eWorkplace is a company that's back on the rise right now. And if you don't know what eWorkplace is, generally they kind of seem like they are part of government and they're trying to push on health and safety, WMIS, requirements or training that might actually be free or a pretty reasonable price, especially if you're a CFIB member, and really charge you a lot of money for these things and make you really feel stressed out that you're doing something wrong in the eyes of the law. So I would just recommend you guys to keep an eye out for these companies and always use your critical thinking when you encounter someone like that.
And feel free to give us a call, give you guys a call, and you can kind of give an impartial, hey, you don't really need that. You get that through your CFIB membership.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We often get these questions.
Yeah.
We often get these questions of, hey, is this a legitimate government agency, or like, can you double check this? And we're happy to, more than happy to help out with that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rachel. Corinne.
Great. So I wanted to just mention before some final words is that I've also had a number of inquiries about new businesses and whether we're doing anything. And I did mention, of course, this continues to be actually one of our highest priority areas that we're pushing government to do. I will say government is aware that this is a big gap in the programs and they are looking at trying to find a solution. However, I think that they're struggling to find a good solution. And so we have been providing them with ideas and some ways that they could do it. But so far, I don't know that they've really gotten very far, but we will continue to advocate on behalf of the many of you that are really not new businesses anymore. Some of you have pointed out because you started last March or last February or last April. And so definitely feel that it's important that you are included in these programs. So please know that that is high on our agenda. Thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Please give us feedback on what you think of some of the upcoming ideas we have for webinars. We want to make sure that these are useful to you. And again, thank you for the information you're providing to us, the questions. I know we can't get to them all, but we are going to use them, and it's absolutely essential to the work that we do. So thank you for inspiring me to do my job. So hopefully you guys have a good week coming up. Thanks.
Thanks, Corinne. So I'll just wrap us up and I'll touch on something Brendan said, something Rachel said, something Corinne said. So Brendan, you talked about getting outside. I can't believe how many, that's showing up now regularly on these lists where it used to be just exercise, eat well, try to make sure you're looking after your sleep. Getting outside is now on those, a standard part of those lists. So, you can, and I think that's for a good reason, for a very good reason, very helpful to just take some deep breaths and get outside. And even if it's a 10-minute walk, as you said, it's done wonders for our team just to do that at one point during regular business hours, go for a walk. And our counselors are a little more cheerful on the phones for you as a result of that. So Rachel mentioned, just call us, if you're having issues or you're unsure about something, however small, like if you're like, sometimes you get those emails and you're like, is this a scam or is this for real? Give us a call. We're happy to help with that. And then Corinne talked about how this is inspiring our work. These webinars are very inspiring for us because we feel more in touch with you. So thank you for all your feedback through the webinars, through the surveys, through the helpline. It really does feel like a great partnership that we have with small business. 50 years ago when John Bullock founded the organization, it was all about being grassroots and giving business owners a voice. And during the pandemic, the value of that, I think, has been shown to be as strong as ever, as strong as when Bullock founded the organization, when the proposal was to tax small businesses at effectively double the rates that big businesses were paying, and was like, we need to have, a voice at those tables. So having a voice, I think, is really important, and the partnership that we have with you in doing that is fantastic. And finally, I'll just say a little, shout out to our first quotes. When the barn burned down and I could see the moon. I think that's a really nice nice way of saying sometimes there's a silver lining to hard times. And I don't know anyone who hasn't had a tough time in the last year that hasn't been made worse either directly or indirectly by COVID. So, you know, we're getting there, and we'll get through it together, and we never give up and we never go away. And don't forget that when the barn burns down, you can see the moon. And with that, I will end the webinar and hope to see you all again next week. Thank you, everyone.